Well, I think we'll begin.
This is Henry Matthews.
This is the second of a series of 6 talks about the history of architecture with a focus on arches, vaults, and domes. But somehow domes seem to have mainly taken over, but that's what's happening. So we'll begin. I think I will sit down so that I don't fall over. If I can grab the right. Well, last week I talked about, I compared Greek and Roman architecture in certain very important respects. Greek architecture is the architecture of columns and beams, post and lintel. We have verticals and horizontals. And we saw also how Greek architecture evolved from early proportions, of which here you see a couple of examples, to the refinement and magnificence of the Parthenon of Athens. And I introduced the 3 orders of architecture, which I'm sure you were mostly familiar with. But these were the elements of Greek architecture. The Romans greatly admired the Greeks and followed them in the use of these 3 orders: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. And these elements, though they changed in their proportions and in minor ways in their expression, were a standard language of architecture. We talk about the classical language of architecture. It has its vocabulary, the various elements, its syntax or grammar, the way in which the use of those is controlled by tradition and custom, and then the expression, just as in language, we can use it in a boring, monotonous way, or we can express emotions or ideas as the Greeks did in their architecture. Okay. We saw how the Romans took the vocabulary of Greek architecture and imposed it on their structural forms. There is the Pont du Gard, a utilitarian structure, to my mind, of great beauty as well as utility. And then the pompous arch of Constantine, who's telling us about all his virtues in this work of architecture. So the arch is dressed up with classical elements from the language that I was talking about. We saw how the Romans went beyond the arch. If you look at the Basilica of Constantine, we can imagine 2 triumphal arches standing opposite each other with the vaulting of the center spanning between them. This was an incredible architectural achievement. Oh, shoot, I'm doing the wrong thing. And then here is the Pantheon. It's a great solid mass of concrete. It's like a huge ceramic bowl turned upside down on a cylinder of thick walls. The walls are 21 feet thick and built of brickwork. And notice that they're not penetrated by any openings, no windows. All the light comes in through the oculus at the top. Ornamentation was something we talked about, and I want to sum this up quickly by saying most ornamentation either came from nature, as in the case of the acanthus leaf on the Corinthian column, and there are many other examples, or praise of the gods and historical events. So the sculpture on Greek temples was related to their purpose, and it was restricted to certain places. For example, the pediment and the metopies, which are not shown there. Well, now we get to the Byzantine, or the roots of the Byzantine era. In 313, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which mandated Christian tolerance throughout, religious tolerance throughout the empire. You remember how the Christians were thrown to the lions for the entertainment of the populace, who found this extremely amusing. But as numbers of Christians grew, Constantine had the wisdom to legitimize their religion, and so Christianity not only became permissible, but in a short while it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we go from a mosaic, not of an emperor, but of a saint. This is St. Paul. I mentioned that the Romans admired the Greeks, but in their temples, although they used a Greek vocabulary, the form is slightly different. Temples were more frontal and raised up. But let's move to another building type, the basilica. This is the remains of a basilica at Pompeii. It was a huge interior space intended for public use on many occasions, with a high central space and light coming in with upper windows. And so when Christianity became legitimate finally, the Christians found that basilicas were ideal places to congregate in. And so on Sundays they filled up with a population worshipping in the new religion. Basilicas went from small, like the one we saw in Pompeii, to really grandiose, like the Basilica Ulpia in the Trajan Forum in Rome, a vast interior space in a complex organized to show off the magnificence of the emperor. In 333, the Church of St. Peter's in Rome the Church of St. Peter's in Rome was built, entered through a courtyard. It was a very long space with a central nave leading to an apse, the semicircular enclosure at the end, double aisles on either side. So this was one of the first large Christian church. It preceded the St. Peter's that we know today. Here is a fresco showing a section through it. See how immensely high it is. I would hate to be in that space when an earthquake occurred, when you see these high walls resting on slender columns and arches. And we'll notice in the Byzantine period, there was a great change in the construction to use huge piers and arches, making a much more dominant structure. So here's some other early Christian churches. Santa Sabina, a beautiful little church, and here's a section and a plan so we can see how it worked. In the upper left side, you can see how the light comes in through the clerestory windows, which are shown on the section here. And so the church would be well illuminated. Santa Costanza is a round church with a dome. It has the same section as a basilica, but it just draws a circle. And this was a beautiful space, again with light coming in through clear story windows and an aisle all around it. And then the aisles were beautiful curved spaces, and the roof was decorated with all kinds of symbols. I love this one here on the left, which shows a cart and was pulled by oxen bringing in a load of grapes, and then there are some very joyful people dancing on the grapes to squeeze out the juice. And that is a point to remind me that the art in early Christian churches was generally joyful. Go into a church from the medieval era and there's a lot of torture. There's the crucifixion and the torture of saints. But here are these people having a lot of fun pressing the grapes and feeling it oozing between their toes. One more round church with a central dome, this one resting just on columns, San Stefano Rotondo. But we'll see how in the Byzantine era the dome and its supports became really significant. So just a quick rundown of historical facts. In 129 BCE, Anatolia, what is now Turkey, becomes the Roman province of Asia. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legitimizing Christianity. In 330, the Emperor Constantine discovered what a beautiful site was available for the small city of Byzantium at the top of the Sea of Marmara, between the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea. And he made this his capital. Rome was a mess. Can you imagine Rome after it existed for centuries and centuries, full of disorder, riots and so on? And here was this beautiful place that he declared to be his new capital. Then the empire divided between east and west. Constantinople was the capital of the east, Rome the capital of the west. But as barbarians came in, so-called barbarians came in and devastated Rome, the capital was removed first to Milan and then to Ravenna. And I'll show you where Ravenna is. On this map, Ravenna is just in the north of Italy, a little way south of Venice, looking out on the Adriatic Sea. And so this was a really important center of new architecture. Then we get to Constantinople. This is Constantinople, one of these lovely composite drawings which are rather hard to find your way around in. But down at the south end is the Basilica of Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, built by Justinian. So here are the walls which completely encircled Constantinople, now Istanbul, of course. And here is the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which in Greece is Hagia Sophia of Constantinople, built by the Emperor Justinian in the middle of the 6th century. It is supported on absolutely massive piers on two sides and hemispherical structures crowned by half domes on the two other sides. And let's compare that with let's compare that with the Pantheon. The Pantheon's built on these immensely thick walls, but if you look now at this diagram, you can see how they developed a system called pendentives, which were curved triangles that supported a dome on 4 arches. And this is the basic system in Hagia Sophia. Compare the Pantheon with this immensely solid structure with Hagia Sophia on the right. The pendentives carry the weight from the arches to the dome, and while the Pantheon has absolutely no openings in the walls, they're solid. They let no light in except through the oculus. The light penetrates from many places, and most significantly, in a ring of windows around the dome. The Pantheon wouldn't have survived if they'd tried to do that. But Byzantine ingenuity, it was designed by Anthemius of Thrals, and my memory's failing me. I'm 88 years old, I'll have to be forgiven. Yes, Theodorus of Miletus. And let's look at the incredible build-up from a huge rectangle on the ground through many, many small arches and 4 big arches to the point where the dome is carried. And here you can see around at this point in the drum of the dome the many, many windows. The plan is like a combination of the Pantheon and the Basilica of Constantine, but much, much lighter. Here's the plan and the section of Hagia Sophia. You can see the solid mass of masonry is only a small part of it compared with the Pantheon. So these people were geniuses of construction. Actually, we don't always get told about this, but the dome did collapse once and was built again at a slightly higher angle so that the forces would spread outwards more. And it's an incredible experience to stand or lie on your back, if you dare do that, and look up at the central dome and the 2 half domes supported on 4 arches, the upper parts of which are penetrated by many windows, and then there are windows in the base of the half domes at either end as well. So the astonishing thing is that this church was built in 5 years. Is that Justinian was one of these people who knew what he wanted, and it was going to happen. Originally, there was a head of Christ, a Christ in majesty, in the dome, and when Mehmet the Conqueror entered Hagia Sophia, he was astonished. First of all, he berated people who had already started tearing up paving stones from the floor and prizing marble off the walls. He said, they said, this is a house of infidels. No, he said, this will be a mosque. And he built some quick minarets on corners of the roof, and they performed, they had their first use of it as a mosque within a week. But when Mehmet the Conqueror was walking around, he looked up into the dome and he saw a strange man looking him in the eye and following him wherever he went, and was pretty rattled by that. And then he climbed up to the roof and looked out over the city that he had conquered. Oh. I like this picture with the scaffolding in it. There's a sort of dynamic there that I enjoy. I have this on the wall outside my apartment here. It's almost easier to understand it in a drawing. Here's a wonderful drawing by an Italian who conveyed it magnificently. Light penetrating through openings in many walls. We can see a little bit of light coming above the gallery and then in the semicircular wall above it. And wherever you look, you see different elements of the design. And one of the things you will notice is that the capitals of the columns are neither Doric, Ionic, nor Corinthian. The stone carvers who were given columns to carve were allowed their own interpretation of what that transition between the vertical and the horizontal might be. And so in Byzantine architecture, you'll see many different capitals which are extremely rich in their detail. In the gallery, there are still a few marvelous mosaics representing Christian themes. They're usually, when I went there first, Hagia Sophia was a museum and it was open to the public and no one could object to these. I think they're covered in curtains now and only opened up on certain days for visitors. But there is Christ in Majesty, flanked by two saints, and in this one, the Virgin and Child, flanked by Justinian and his wife Theodora, who are totally magnificent. So now we're going to Ravenna, which became the capital of the Western Empire in the 5th century. The Church of San Vitale was a local saint, and they did him proud with this amazing design. Look at the plan. You will see that it's an octagon within an octagon. There's an aisle running all the way around the inner octagon, which is penetrated by 8 arches, and 7 of them are linked by 3 columns with arches. Then on the right, there's a diagram showing how it gradually rises up to the central dome. So the basilica, the long basilica leading to an apse, has been left behind for a centralized building with a dome at its center. And when we go in, we look up and see the 8, here are 3 of the 8 arches. It's disappointing to find that the dome was decorated in the 17th century with Baroque ornament that doesn't quite fit. So what I will show you in more detail is what you'll see easily lower down. We look up here at two doves drinking from a huge bowl, flanked by saints. When I took these pictures a few years ago, and these are the first time I've seen them. They just languished in storage, but what I didn't seem to have with me was interpretation of all the iconography. Maybe someone will be able to help me out. Who are these two saints? Any ideas? And then up above, in the corners of the sort of dome-like structure, are a couple of angels.
No, they're the four evangelists.
Wait a minute. And then here in the half dome over the apse is Christ, a youthful Christ at the center, flanked by angels, and Saint Vitalis himself is here, and a bishop holding a model of the church on the right.
It's the pointer, Henry. Why don't you go back and show them the church that's being handed over?
The church is being handed, here's the model of the church. A diagonal view shows one corner of that scene that we last looked at in the half dome over the windows in the apse. And then down below, center left or bottom left, is the Emperor Justinian with his courtiers. So let's look at a close-up view of that. Look at him surrounded by holy men, and on the left, soldiers to protect him. And then on the right, the Empress Theodora. Apparently, when Justinian was a young man, he used to hang around slightly insalubrious places, and he met a young woman named Theodora, who was an entertainer, maybe in more ways than one, but she became the empress and became an honored figure, and there she is with her ladies in waiting on the other side. And see how these two look us in the eye. Again, the capitals are different from the Greek and Roman capitals. Again, the stone carver was able to make a unique design, and sometimes they even differ between different ones in the same churches. In San Vitale, we're constantly looking through from one area to another. Here we are standing in front of the altar, and we look, and from one side looking across the space that the altar is in to frescoes or mosaics on the other side. And the mosaics tell all kinds of stories. I think I've left out a few that I could have shown you. Disappointing. I'm very excited because these are the first time I've seen these slides that I took several years ago. And then there's another small building in Ravenna called the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Galla Placidia was the daughter of one emperor and the husband of another, and she died, I think, in a painful way, and it's not actually a mausoleum because she's buried in Rome, but she definitely left her mark architecturally. This is the dome. Look at those angels.
Henry, the four evangelists. You told me that.
But do the four evangelists have wings?
You see the cow, the man, the eagle, and
Oh, the bull, yes, you're right. And a sky full of stars. Oh, I keep pressing the wrong one. And then here is a dreadful fire under a gridiron, as if intended for torture. I'm not sure who was to be tortured there. And on the left is a cabinet that contains the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then in one of these arches is Christ the Good Shepherd. And again, I want to emphasize that in this period, we didn't see crucifixions. We saw Christ as the Good Shepherd. Perhaps since this was a time when people were being welcomed into the Christian church, they had an idea of making it more appealing. And this is, I think, one of the most beautiful examples of Byzantine. This is sort of on the cusp between early Christian and Byzantine art, Christ the Good Shepherd. And don't those sheep look happy? But this one is less happy. There seems to be some instrument of torture there, but it's not explained. This is a gorgeous little building. I twice had the experience of walking into it and meeting some people I knew. So the third time I went there, I looked around and there was no one to surprise me.
It's a geode. It's a simple exterior and a gorgeous interior.
Yes.
going forward.
And now we move to Sicily, to Monreale, where the Norman king William II fell asleep while he was hunting, and took a break, fell asleep, and an angel appeared to him and told him to build a church in this place outside the city. And if you climb the hill up to Monreale, you'll find this absolutely gorgeous church, not a domed church, and it's more like a basilica with a long nave leading to an apse. These Norman kings were the cousin of William the Conqueror of England, and I'm not surprised they headed for Sicily, which has a beautiful climate. They had a better time than William of England. But this William, this Norman king built an incredibly beautiful apse and had it decorated with Christ in Majesty, a common Byzantine theme. And all the spandrels above the arches are similarly brought to life with stories from the Bible. There's a beautiful cloister there at Monreale, and the capitals of the columns have again differed from the Greek and Roman ones. This style of capital is more common in the Romanesque era. So many churches in France have beautiful carved capitals with all kinds of biblical scenes and warnings about what sins we might commit and so on. But these are wonderful examples in the cloisters at Monreale. I wish I could read the iconography. I don't know what's going on there. Could that be Adam and Eve?
No, they're both men. The first one was Adam and Eve. First one was Adam and Eve. Oh yeah, that would be. Yeah, you're right. Adam and Eve here. Oh, we thought he was stabbing them.
I apologize for not reading up on the iconography. It's a little obscure. Actually, I was looking at one example, a few examples, and the author didn't know. A beautiful church in Greece. It's on, if you're driving from Athens to the Peloponnese, before you get to Eleusis, you find this church at Daphne with a wonderful Christ in majesty in the dome. Very, very memorable. Oh, I keep doing this. And then I'm going to go to another place in Sicily. This is the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, built by the Norman kings of Sicily in the 12th century. And he employed artists from Constantinople, which was to become Istanbul, who decorated this chapel with the most amazing mosaics. Christ in Majesty is a central theme of Byzantine architecture, decoration. Here's an oblique view of the Palatine Chapel. This, I think, is the Dormition of the Virgin Mary. Two saints, St. Paul and St. Peter, giving each other a good hug. And in the next one, the baptism of Christ.
No, Paul.
It's the baptism of.
Paul on the other side, he's got the same beard.
That's true. The baptism of St. Paul, and there happened to be a very suitable large goblet for him to jump into wherever they decided to do it. So, again, the walls are absolutely rich with ornament and biblical stories. And finally, this is a place in Greece. Oh, I have plenty of time. I could have spent longer here. I thought I was running out of time, so I didn't put in more pictures. It's near Sparta in the southern Peloponnese. You go over the Taygetus Mountains, and then you come down to this beautiful green space where there was a kingdom in the 14th and 15th centuries that built many churches here and a palace and presumably houses which have somehow disappeared. But this is just one of many places that you could go in the Eastern Mediterranean and enjoy Byzantine architecture. So I would be happy to answer any questions. First, let me tell you that next week, also on Thursday, I'll be talking about Islamic architecture. I've written a book on the mosques of Istanbul, and then so that is something that I've studied quite a bit. I had absolutely no idea of the proliferation of mosques, the variety in designs. There was one architect who was the chief architect of three sultans in the 16th century over a period of 50 years. And whereas Michelangelo and Brunelleschi built one big dome each, incomparable domes, Mimar Sinan was responsible for 40 or 50 mosques in Istanbul and elsewhere. I'm passing around a book on Hagia Sophia. I was only asked to write the chapter on Hagia Sophia after the conquest, the Muslim conquest, but it has some wonderful pictures of Hagia Sophia. Well, you have a question at the back there.
And Bill has a question.
Just a couple things. You emphasized the joy of the earlier depictions in the buildings. I'm reminded that Chartres Cathedral has, in the entire life of Christ, nothing of the crucifixion. It appears nowhere, and none of the saints is shown with the instruments of his death. It's an extremely joy-directed Gothic cathedral. I also wanted to make a comment about the Pantheon, that tremendously thick wall that counters the thrust of the dome is very cleverly done in that on the interior there are chapels carved out, and that happens on the exterior as well. So the wall is really quite a serpentine kind of thing, and this would have been essential for the curing of the concrete. If it had been a solid 20 foot deep, the concrete could never have cured. So the Romans really put into that a tremendous knowledge of engineering that is deceptive when you just take it as a chunk. That exterior wall is a very clever piece of design. It achieves its depth through a serpentine kind of configuration. It's a wonderful building, and I appreciated your pictures and your discussion of it. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that extra information, yes.
Wow, that was exciting. Here comes Bill.
You've shown us examples of churches. You've mentioned mosques. Were there any synagogues built in this time, and what kind of architecture did they use?
That's a good question. I have come across synagogues in ancient cities in Turkey, quite small and not very much left to show what they were like. Do you know anything about that, Grant?
No, I don't. Nothing at all. I studied early Islamic architecture, but not the Jewish, not the Jewish buildings. I know nothing about them.
I just had a comment on I believe it was the Spanish who introduced the crucifix into their art versus the cross. And so the bloody depictions go to the Spanish.
How did I not know that for all these years? Yes.
Here, I've got the mic.
The buildings had windows everywhere. Was there glass, or how did they protect the interior from pigeons, from whatever?
Yes, even the Greeks developed some use of glass, but the Romans much more, and the windows, they were, the way they made flat sheets of glass was to blow glass into huge bottles and then turn them into cylindrical bottles, and then cut them open and flatten them out. If you go to the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, you may see people doing something like that. Which reminds me that when the Crystal Palace was built in London, it was designed by Joseph Paxton, who was actually a gardener who had built huge glass houses on ancestral estates for nobility. And so when they wanted to build a great exhibition, first plans came up to build it all in masonry, and Paxton rushed to London with a proposal to build it all with glass. And they said, this is impossible, that won't hold up. But he had his way because it was quicker and cheaper. But he was told that the dimensions of the largest piece of glass was related to how the glass blower with the biggest lungs how far he could blow it. And he said, well, Paxton said, well, you've got to blow harder, because that's not going to work for the Crystal Palace. I need it bigger. And they did. The history of the world is full of stories of people rising to the occasion.
The period of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries is usually described as Romanesque, and yet everything that you've shown us today, which is 700 or 800 years earlier, has many Romanesque features. Why is that?
Well, I suppose they were developing. They were emerging. I mean, Romanesque is an interesting word because it sounds like sort of almost Roman, but not quite. They understood the Roman invention of vaulting and used it magnificently. Barrel vaults, groin vaults, and other types of vaults. And then the ornament in Romanesque churches was very figurative. I think I can't fit in the medieval era in this series. Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to say, Henry, you really dramatized the difference between the Greek and the Roman. I found that very well done. The Roman address to grand spaces you illustrated awfully well, and it is an enormous difference. For all the Greek features in Roman work, it is a radically different approach to architecture as space rather than as object, and it's an enormous heritage that they left. Yeah.
And then in the Byzantine era, the structures became, in a way, more fluid. They didn't have these rigid verticals of applied columns and entablatures dividing a wall into smaller parts. The whole structure sort of flowed from the ground to the crown of the dome, and then diagonally through arcades in all directions.
I wanted to say one thing about the...
Wait, sorry. Hold on.
There was a dry run for Hagia Sophia, you perhaps know it, St. Sergius and Bacchus, which was by the same architects at a smaller scale. And I was there once at Ramadan, which was an awkward time for a Westerner to be in Istanbul. But we went, a friend and I, into St. Sergius and Bacchus. They were chipping away the mosaics and whitewashing them. 5, I think, Islamic monks, and they looked at us as though they wished we were dead, and we got out of there in a hurry. I was so sorry. I wanted to spend some time looking at the building.
That's a very interesting little church.
Yes,
I was going to include it, but I thought I thought I wouldn't have time, but actually I did. It's called Küçük Hagia Sophia, Little Hagia Sophia, by the Turks. Yes.
I wish you'd talk a little bit about the mosaics and how they're made and the great colors and everything about those tiny little things.
Well, they were very, very expert in cutting glass and colored stone into very small squares and setting it in mortar. It's almost unimaginable when you think of a huge surface, a huge curved surface, and you've got a basket full of little colored stones. How do you get them in the right place and get them to stay there and not falling on your head while you're halfway through it? That's a very good question, and I wish I knew more about it.
I am puzzled by the fact that Ravenna is in Italy, and yet it seems to have been a great center of Byzantine art.
Yes.
Wait, are you answering? Are you answering?
Thank you. That part of Italy was reconquered by Justinian, and it later became, so earlier it was the capital of the Western Empire.
But it's really a style unto itself, isn't it, the Ravenna?
Yes, and I didn't show the basilican churches in Ravenna, which are absolutely magnificent, also have wonderful mosaics. But it was a great center of architecture. And actually, I think San Vitale is one of the most extraordinary buildings in the whole history of architecture.
We keep using the term Byzantine architecture. The empire was never known as the Byzantine Empire. It was always known as the Eastern Roman Empire. And the citizens were Romans, not Byzantines.
Yes, absolutely.
And that term Byzantine, as I understand it, came along from German historians long after the Eastern Roman Empire was conquered. So it's, in a way, to me, it's an incorrect term.
We've really got to watch our P's and Q's here at Horizon House. We've got so many, I'm sorry, I think
that's a very
she's
good.
first and then you,
But
okay?
from that era, particularly in Constantinople, a way of building emerged that seemed to captivate people far and wide. I mean, Palermo is a long way from Constantinople, but look what they did.
I do have a question. The colors that you had in your photographs of the interiors of those churches were just beautiful. They were so amazingly bright and clear. Have they been repainted, or is it a trick of the photography? How can that be? Because they were just beautiful.
That's a good question. Well, I've been to Ravenna several times.
But they're not paintings. That's one of the answers.
They're mosaics.
They're mosaics.
So you wipe them with a damp cloth and they come back to life.
That's the reason they survive so good.
Henry, I think it was the Ravenna church that had a dome inside and a pitched roof outside. Why was that?
Good question. Well, the small, well, we were talking about the small mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Yes.
Now I see why they have two people.
I think that was an easy way to build it. The walls went up higher, and the weight of the walls took the thrust of the dome. But that's unusual. At San Vitale, you see the dome on the outside.
Okay, here's Don.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your presentation. Linnea and I have been to Hagia Sophia twice, and now we'd like to go again after having heard you.
You should all go. Well, Susan and I were incredibly lucky. She got a Fulbright fellowship to teach at a university in Istanbul, and I managed to get year's leave at the same time. And so we lived there, actually it was half a year, but we lived there, enjoyed it so much. It's a vital city, full of all kinds of experiences, wonderful food, as well as all kinds of other things. The Turkish people are incredibly welcoming and supportive.
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, when we were there the first time, across the road, so to speak, from Hagia Sophia, there was at that time a Turkish carpet museum where they had replicas of very famous Turkish carpets. And we bought one.
Oh,
and it's in our living room now. It's about 5 feet.
You could have brought it down
Has
here.
all kinds of symbolism. In the center of it is Adam and Eve. It's really interesting.
Oh, that's
I think at this point, Hagia Sophia has reverted to being a mosque, right? Is
Yes,
it, did you
well,
say
back
it's
and
not
forth.
open to the public?
It is open to the public, yeah.
It is now again.
It's on. Hello? I believe it's been turned back into a mosque. You said you have a mic.
Oh, yes. Ataturk turned it into a museum. He insisted that it was of world importance, and there were plenty of mosques in Istanbul. But when Erdogan came in and put an end to the secularization that Ataturk led, it was reverted. It reverted to a mosque, and I suppose it's not seen as quite right for public to go in at the time, at one of the times of a call to prayer where it's full of people praying. Though how full it could be is an interesting
Any
question.
more questions? Great, thank you all very much. Oh, one more question from Bob.
Just a comment, but Bev and I spent, I think it was just 2-3 days in Ravenna, but I just wanted to comment that, it was a busy place.
Yes.
And I remember one of the more notable structures there was a mausoleum for somebody or other who was an invader from the north, but he was a Christian. Anyway, it gets confusing. Another thing, if you get, the mosaics are remarkable. They just endure forever and they're alive. And if you want to give it a try, that's where you go, as Ravenna has a wonderful mosaic making workshop, and you can continue the tradition.
So did you bring back any mosaics you'd made?
No, but we left a friend there that left the art tour so she could stay and do that.
Oh, cool.
I'm going to add a literary postscript here. Dante died in Ravenna. He was exiled from Florence for his politics, and went to Ravenna and died there. So that also makes Ravenna important to me.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether his tomb is there or not, but he did die there.
Well, thank
Thank
you all
you.
very much for coming and your excellent questions.